Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, I want to recognize and thank the Dora Foundation and Eaton Vance for making this program possible. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odle. I'm an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. In celebration and reflection of our 140th year, we have been focusing inward toward our own craft origin stories. Naturally, this has led us to the origin stories of craft culture in America. So we are joined today by Dr. Tiffany Momon, public historian, assistant professor of history and Mellon Fellow at the University of the South, and founder of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archives. This evening, Dr. Momon will guide us through her incredible research in tracing the original craftspeople of our country and the work to give ownership to our crafts and trades. With that, I will hand this over to you, Dr. Momon.
Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And so I titled this presentation today In the Making, of course, to follow the theme of this series of lectures. And before I jump into it, I want to begin this evening with two stories of how this project came to be in the making. So this is my beginning. I approached this work through my love of the decorative arts. One of my first major decorative arts projects was to interpret the room pictured on screen. This architectural interior is in the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and it is known as the Cortland Room. My project, one summer as a student, was to interpret the home that this room had once been a part of. You see, the museum had taken this entire room from its cornice to its floorboards to all of the overmantel and the mantel itself, out of a home that was located in Southampton County, Virginia. And so at first glance, I, of course, was attracted to the objects in the room. And the architectural history nerd in me was very interested in the room's neoclassical stylings. But it was not until I dug deeper that I truly understood what this room actually was. And for so long, the narrative had been that this room was part of the house pictured on screen. That home was owned by the Robert Ricks family, a Quaker family in Southampton County, Virginia, and it was constructed about 1810. And now as a student of African American history, I immediately went Southampton County, like Southampton County, site of the Nat Turner Uprising. And yes, it is that exact Southampton County. And turns out that this home was just mere steps from where that uprising took place. The family, the Ricks family who lived here, owned enslaved people, including blacksmiths named Doc, Billy, Moses, and Jerry. And this room is still literally held together by some of the original nails crafted by those Black craftspeople over a century ago. The contractor on the job was named Edmund Godwin, and through primary source research, I uncovered that he used the labor of enslaved men and Black apprentices, including brothers William and Mears Ashe, in the construction of this home. When Robert Ricks died, he left behind in his will a message to his heirs and indicated that the blacksmiths were to be allowed to keep their tools. And he also wrote, quote, "I desire that my sons should have and enjoy the privilege of the blacksmith's work being done by the smiths." But you never heard that story on the tour prior to 2016. And for someone like me, the presence of Doc, Billy, Moses, Jerry, and William and Mears Ashe is a story worth telling. There was a team behind the creation of this room and the creation of that house, so we should consider them as makers. few years later, I found myself back at that same museum taking another class. Only this time, the work that I was tasked to do would lead me on an even greater journey. On screen is a map of the peninsula of Charleston, South Carolina. And this story begins in Charleston in late May of 1750, when John Williams, formerly known as Quash, walked the route that you see mapped out on screen here. And on that walk, he was leaving the Pinckney Mansion, headed to the office of the South Carolina Gazette at the corner of Trad and King Streets. Williams's visit to the office of the South Carolina Gazette was to place an ad in the newspaper for his carpentry and joinery services. Of his services, Williams wrote, John Williams, carpenter and joiner, living near the Naval Office in Charlestown, gives notice that he is ready and willing to undertake all manner of carpenters' and joiners' work, or any buildings that shall be thought proper to be offered to him. And, as he is a free man, he promises that whosoever shall please to employ him shall find not only their work well done and handsomely finished, but with great fidelity, justice, and dispatch. All persons favors in employing him will with the greatest gratitude be acknowledged by their most humble servant, John Williams. From his trip to the office of the South Carolina Gazette newspaper, Williams returned to his worksite of the Charles Pinckney Mansion located at the corner of East Bay and Ginyard Streets in Charleston. Although emancipated just weeks before, Williams continued to work in his role of master carpenter at the mansion, overseeing the building's finishing touches. Meanwhile, Williams's carpentry work crew consisted of several enslaved men owned by Pinckney and others that continued to labor at the mansion under Williams's leadership. It was still business as usual at the mansion, although Williams had done what few Black men before him ever had by placing an advertisement in the South Carolina Gazette. The other men, women, and children enslaved by the Pinckneys might have reacted with surprise when hearing of Williams's visit to the South Carolina Gazette office. Those same enslaved men, women, and children may have been shocked to have learned of Williams' emancipation only 2 weeks earlier, which was a very rare event among the people enslaved by the Pinckneys. The enslaved men who worked under Williams's leadership could only hope that their carpentry expertise provided them with the same opportunity to become free and live a life supported by their craft. The two previous accounts of craftsmen enslaved by Edmund Godwin and the Ricks family in Southampton County, Virginia, and John Quash Williams in Charleston, South Carolina, are just two of the thousands of accounts that tell the stories of enslaved and free Black craftspeople who contributed to the building of this country. These stories form the foundation of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a digital humanities site dedicated to documenting the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from this country's beginnings through 1900. This presentation will discuss the methodology behind the BCDA, while also discussing how we can use digital archives and digital maps to ask new questions, to record new findings, and to explore Black life in vast early America. So now, here's a formal introduction to the website that you can find at blackcraftspeople.org. The website is currently home to the records connected to the lives of 399 Black craftspeople, both men and women, both free and enslaved, involved in 25 total trades, from wheelwrights and tanners to cabinet makers and goldsmiths, who lived and labored in the 18th century South Carolina Low Country. We launched our beta or testing version of the website on August 31st, 2020. Our Phase 2 website will make its debut in just 2 weeks. Working together as a team, we consulted with digital humanists, GIS developers, archivists, and website designers to complete what you see here. We started out as a fully self-funded project, but we've recently received a grant that will allow us to go beyond the state of South Carolina into the state of Tennessee. The website's homepage will bring you to this area where you can select different options to explore the website. Exhibits will be there in 2 weeks, but available now are both the beta versions of the archive and the digital map. A click over to the archives page will bring you here, where you have the option to browse by collection organized by trade, use the search engine to find Black craftspeople by keyword, or even to contribute your own research or knowledge on Black craftspeople fully attributed to you. Browsing collections will bring you to a page where you can currently explore Black craftspeople involved in 25 trades. The selection of a trade and craftsperson will bring you to that person's profile. The profiles are organized using Dublin Core and Library of Congress subject matter headings, and they include facts about the craftsperson's life, primary source documentation, in this instance, a runaway slave advertisement, and a transcription of that advertisement. In this example, we see the profile of an enslaved spinner named Judy. George Muckenfoos held Judy in bondage, and on August 25th, 1779, he placed a notice in the South Carolina Gazette that Judy had self-emancipated and left his bondage with a free man of color named Andrew. The second component of the BCDA is a digital map placing craftspeople on the landscape of the South Carolina Lowcountry. A click over to the maps page will bring you here, where you have the ability to search the data in a variety of ways. You can search through the trade counts box by clicking the bar graphs of a specific trade. You can click the little blue arrow to the left of the screen and search through drop-down menus. Or you can skip both of those options and search by pie chart. Clicking a specific trade on that pie chart will show you individuals involved in that trade only. And here I've selected the shoemakers. Each different way you search will cause craftspeople listed in the far right column to change. Here I've highlighted the bricklayers on the pie chart, so bricklayers are populated in that column. If we continue on this map view, you can see that each of the light gray dots on the map represent bricklayers. If you were to click one of the dots, you would then get this information box on London, an enslaved bricklayer who self-emancipated from Thomas Farr's plantation in St. Mark's Parish, Sumter County, South Carolina. Included in this box, if you scroll down, is a link, and that link will take you to London's profile in the archive, thus connecting the primary source and possibly only documentation of London's life to a specific location. Before we move on, I do want to show you what the map looks like for a more urban area, such as Charleston. So right now we're looking at Charleston, and you can see landmarks such as Waterfront Park and well-known streets such as Broad Street and King Street. But I am most interested in this little blue dot on the corner of Meeting Street and King Street and Queen Street within the yellow square. Clicking that blue dot brings us to the story of Joe, an enslaved jeweler held in bondage by well-known Charleston jeweler John Paul Grimke. Here, we've connected Joe to the location of Grimke's home and shop in 1771. And down there to the bottom right is the hotel, which stands on the site of Grimke's shop today. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of the archive and the map, but now I would like to talk about the why. Why the BCDA? Well, first, the BCDA exists because of my research into the previously discussed John Williams and his work on the Pinckney Mansion. What I discovered combing through the papers of Charles Pinckney and his wife Eliza Lucas Pinckney was that the couple that enslaved Williams, was that there were more enslaved craftsmen involved in the construction of their mansion that had previously gone unrecorded. Not only that, but Pinckney was sending them out across the state to perform work on his other properties. These enslaved craftsmen were leaving their mark in literal footprints across the city of Charleston. I soon found myself mapping the other locations of their work, and before I knew it, I had a test map and the inspiration to grow the map into something much larger. But most importantly, the other large, well-known decorative arts archives and research centers with this type of data were not looking at the data the same way that I was. I wanted a resource to use that moved beyond traditional archival collections of craftspeople and just the endless collection and cataloging of names. I wanted to better visualize the data. I wanted to ask more questions, interpret the data, and I wanted to see Black craftspeople. And I found that the best way for me to see them was through place. I wanted to facilitate discussions on movement, hence the creation of the map. And I found that there was just so much more to the story that it became a situation for me where I was like, in the words of the late Congressman John Lewis, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? And we're only beginning in this work. I mentioned that our beta site is live, and the second phase of our website will go live in about 2 weeks, but there is so much more to come, and I am so excited about it. And as you've seen, the sources that we are using in this beta launch of the website are runaway slave advertisements. We intentionally began with runaway slave advertisements because I was immediately interested in the descriptions of what self-emancipated craftspeople were taking with them. For example, were they taking their tools? Additionally, I was interested in what they were wearing. For example, did they run away wearing their work apron? And so often you'll come across these advertisements where they raise just so many questions. For example, advertisements provide us with a wealth of information on not only practice trades, but also physical descriptions, literacy, language, possible reasons why these craftspeople self-emancipated, possible destinations, the locations of family members, and more. And in doing this work, I was inspired by the work of historians like Lorenzo Green, who began compiling this information on New England in the 1940s, and Lathan Winley, who began re-examining and compiling this data on the South back in the 1970s. And in so many ways, the advertisements speak for themselves, but it is up to us as scholars and historians and researchers to analyze and interpret them. And I want to mention once more that the BCDA is so much more than a collection of names. We are a liberatory archive, as defined by scholar Michelle Caswell. We believe in belonging, building community, and the future. And our archive operates on the 5 principles that you see on screen. Number 1, to recognize and celebrate the contributions of Black craftspeople to the diaspora. 2, to educate the public and facilitate conversations on the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople. To connect Black craftspeople to place and the power of place. To build community with the public and with contemporary Black craftspeople. And to actively believe in our work and its ability to impact the future. Oops. And so for the work that we do at the BCDA, there are 3 avenues that best lead us to our conclusions. And I want to point out here that all 3 of these avenues pictured on screen rest on the foundation of the context of Black life. And I also want to stress that there is no one size fits all to this type of work. It is very much so case by case, person by person. But this work is important work and it is very timely. And so our methodology consists of these three avenues. And first, we begin by examining primary and secondary written sources. And these can be anything from newspaper articles to census records to wills and estate records to private papers, letters held by a family. We comb through these records looking for the details and the names of people, and then we record all of that info. And it really is us combing through the records. For the work that's going to launch in 2 weeks on the state of Tennessee, we began by opening up the 1870 census for Nashville, Tennessee, and literally reading it line by line. And as we read the census, we came across names, occupations, and races for people that we jotted down to include in the archive. Next, we turn to objects. And the one thing that I like to stress about objects is that we look beyond the beauty and traditional art history-based object study methods. Our purpose in examining these objects is to really highlight the person behind them and to research them more to find out about their creation and the person who aided in that creation. For example, if we take the antebellum home of an enslaver as an object, we would then begin by researching to find out who was enslaved there, how many people were enslaved there. And for that type of research, we can use wills, estate records, and slave schedules, which were found with the 1850 and 1860 United States Census. And our third avenue to doing this type of work is to examine place. Now, I've written on the screen to just go, and that was a lot easier pre-COVID. But what we're looking to do here when I say place is I'm thinking beyond just latitude and longitude points. I'm thinking of place and I'm relating it to the presence of people. And I'll show you what I mean further in just a moment. So now let's jump into a few stories that use this methodology for approaching research. And I'll begin with the primary and secondary sources and doing a work that I call layering the sources. And so this will begin with the story of Dudley C Jones. By 1830, Louisville, Kentucky was home to a sizable free Black community, which represented nearly 1/5 of the Black population of Louisville by 1860. And one member of that community was Dudley C Jones, a free man of color born in 1805. In 1853, police arrested Jones on the charge of aiding an enslaved woman named Mary in her escape from her enslaver, J.G. Matthews. When Mary escaped, she was hidden in the home of a woman named Georgina Stevenson, a free woman of color, and disguised as a boy when she was captured shortly before her relocation to Jones's home. While there is evidence that police arrested Jones, I have yet to find evidence that he was sentenced for the crime of aiding Mary. By 1858, Jones had returned to his life as a cabinet maker. And on screen is the 1850 U.S. Census listing on the bottom left for Dudley C. Jones. And you'll see there that it lists his profession and occupation as cabinet maker. Additionally, we have an 1853 newspaper notice from the Louisville Daily Courier that alerted people to Dudley C. Jones's arrest. We also have the Louisville City Directory on screen, and you can see Dudley C. Jones highlighted at the bottom, as well as his address of 205 West Market Street in Louisville. And that FMC that you see there next to his name is Free Man of Color. And at the very top of the screen, using the information found in the city directory, we were then able to pull a Sanborn map that shows us what West Market Street looked like in Louisville. And we were able to match the street numbers to pinpoint a location of Dudley C. Jones's cabinet making shop. And it is outlined for you there in red. And so as you can see here, we pulled a variety of sources from a newspaper advertisement to the census to a city directory and a map to flesh out this story of Dudley C. Jones. And here's another example that is heavy on the sources. So when we at the BCDA began to think about what region, state, area we wanted to go to next, I suggested that we head to the Caribbean. I was very curious to see what we would find. And so our latest research area that will debut in the summer of this year is Jamaica. And so what makes the hunt for craftspeople in Jamaica so interesting is that most runaway slave advertisements list where the self-emancipated craftsperson was from. For example, if you look at the middle advertisement on screen, you can see that it's about a self-emancipated tanner named James Crean. But if you look very closely, you see the note behind his name, born in Virginia. Additionally, the advertisement for Billy on the far right of the screen mentions that Billy is from the Coromantee country. The term Coromantee was an English word for people who were from present-day Ghana on the coast of West Africa. And I've also included an advertisement here on the left for a self-emancipated carpenter named Apollo. And what's interesting about Apollo's advertisement here is that it also mentions that he was branded. He was marked with the letters WH or SH on his shoulders. And if you look down at the very bottom of that advertisement, you'll see the name William Harris. I can't help but to think that the WH brand on Apollo's shoulder corresponds to the initials of his enslaver, William Harris. And so let's talk about objects. So when we shared this writing desk on our Instagram account a few weeks ago, we received so many comments that were essentially the equivalent of wow. So many people were amazed by this writing desk made by William Howard that you see pictured on screen. So what is very interesting about this desk, number one, besides it just being so incredibly unique in its design, is the fact that Howard carved all of the tools pictured here and nailed them to the front of the desk. And if you look very closely, you can see a gun, a sword, forks, knives, a shovel, a boot, a hand, a cotton scale, bottles, a chisel, an axe, and more. Now, this particular piece, again, crafted by William Howard, is held at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And they have a very nice video providing some of the context, historical context for William Howard in this piece. And you can find it on their website. But I want to spend just a few more minutes talking a little bit more about William Howard. Now, primary and secondary research, source research, tells us more about who William Howard was as a person. At the bottom right, you can see him listed on the 1870 U.S. Census for the town of Camden in Madison County, Mississippi, not too far from the state capital of Jackson. The 1870 census lists William as a 65-year-old farm laborer, his wife Sally as keeping house, and their son Henry as a farm laborer. What's so interesting about this census record, and I'll see if I can move my mouse over there, is that if you look here for William's place of birth, you will see that his place of birth is listed as Africa. So more research into William revealed that he was enslaved by Mississippi Governor William McWillie on the Kirkwood plantation in Kirkwood, Mississippi. Now, before the Civil War, Kirkwood Plantation was home to 200 enslaved individuals. And when you look at the tools on his desk, they are all tools that you would think would be involved in plantation and farm labor type of work. And so I found a description of Kirkwood written by a woman named Mrs. N.D. Dupress. And she wrote in her 1902 book, Historic Homes of Mississippi, that Kirkwood Plantation was, quote, a colonial pile with broad halls, large rooms, and conservatory, gardens, and a wide lawn. It was taken down. The carved woodwork of the library was given to a church, together with the handsome stairwell. Tall trees grow where once spacious halls and lofty rooms echoed. And so there's no doubt in my mind here that if the McWillie family, who was the plantation where these deaths are attributed to, also had William Howard involved in the woodwork that Mrs. N.D. Dupress mentions in her statement. And if you look at the top right of the screen here, this is the only picture that I was able to find of Kirkwood. And as you can see, it's not very clear because, again, part of this work is also hunting down other objects that we can attribute to some of these craftspeople. And so I want to show you another object. And this particular object is this limestone fireplace. And that limestone fireplace is on the interior of this house pictured on screen. And this is the circa 1937 John Henry Carruthers house. And this is a picture pre-renovation. So as you can see, the family had long stopped living in it, and some vandals unfortunately decided that they would spray paint the building. But the house now I'm very thankful that it's being restored. So in 1937, John Henry Carruthers and his son Ezell built this house using an architectural plan that they purchased. It is a 1.5-story farmhouse with limestone exterior walls. And John Henry and his son Ezell actually quarried the stone found on that fireplace, as well as the stone found on the exterior of the home from an area on this farm that they own. The farm is about 26 acres. And so the Carruthers property here not only speaks to the life of John Henry and his son Ezell and their fine craftsmanship, but it also speaks to African American placemaking, speaks to Black life, it speaks to farm life in what was at that time rural Tennessee. And it also happens to be on the National Register of Historic Places. But what's also interesting about Carruthers is that he also built 2 other homes in Franklin, Tennessee, and they both also had a limestone exterior made of limestone from his farm. And now I want to talk about place and the important place. And place just so happens to be our third and final avenue of our methodology here. And so this is the Promised Land community. And I love that name, Promised Land, because it speaks directly to the hopes and aspirations of the African American freedmen and women who settled on this land shortly after emancipation. The founders of Promised Land were all newly emancipated African American men and women who were enslaved on nearby farms, and a great number of them were enslaved at the Cumberland Furnace Iron Works in Dickson County, Tennessee. So this is a community settled by Black iron workers. And that particular furnace produced objects such as pig iron, and even some decorative elements such as the circa 1795 to 1825 andiron that is a product of the Beaver Creek Iron Works in Sullivan County, Tennessee. Some of those settlers include the Bowen, Redden, Van Leer, and Nesbitt families. And so in 1881, the Nesbitt brothers purchased land to build a church and school, thus building institutions in their community. The Promised Land School on screen in the top left dates to 1899. And now Promised Land was the largest African American community in Dickson County, Tennessee, until its slow decline beginning in the 1920s as a result of the Great Migration. By 1936, the local iron furnaces closed, and so many more residents moved away to find work. Now, this community once contained several stores and about 50 homes, but what remains today is just the school and the church, both built by community members. And on screen, the Promised Land School today functions as a museum. And on screen is a very poor image, but it's a picture of one of the museum exhibits inside of that building that highlights all of the Black furnace workers who lived in the community in 1880. And so our last place that I want to bring some attention to is Ryerson Chapel in Cooperstown, Tennessee. And Ryerson Chapel is a church dating back to the 1930s, and it was home to an African American congregation. This site also was home to a school, which no longer stands, as well as a cemetery. And this church was built by members of that church, and it was used by its parishioners until about the 1990s. And a local community group today is working to restore the church and take care of the cemetery. What makes this church so interesting to me is that when you go inside, it's almost like stepping back in time. And I've included an image here for you on screen of one of the handmade pews there that's still inside the church. And I've also included a picture of one of the handmade grave markers here. And if you look at that grave marker, the top image, you can barely just make out a carving that looks like a hand. And in the bottom image, I've put my hand over that particular carving. The rear of that stone says "To Mama," and they also carved their hand in there. And I'd never seen a hand carving on a stone like that before, so I just thought it was very, very interesting. But by visiting places such as Promised Land and Ryerson Chapel, we at the BCDA get to experience the places constructed by Black craftspeople, and we get to sit in the long forgotten church pews crafted by Black hands. And so, as I've mentioned, this project is all about centering Black craftspeople. And one of the things that I do when I usually teach on this subject is I include this image, which is from a map. And it's a map of St. Stephen's Parish, South Carolina in 1773. And this is an image that's found in the right corner of the bottom of the map. And if you look very closely, you can see enslaved laborers. And what they're actually doing in this image is that they're processing indigo. And so you can see them carrying the indigo harvest. And you can see that there's an enslaved gentleman there at the well pumping. And then you can see two enslaved men at the indigo vats. There's another here, perhaps setting out the indigo cakes so that they can dry. You have another here also doing some type of labor with the indigo cakes. And you have another here next to a barrel packing those indigo cakes for shipping. And if you look down below, they are being supervised by a white gentleman and a young boy. So when I think about centering Black craftspeople, I'm immediately drawn to this image, but I'm immediately drawn to the workers, which is why I have, to the enslaved laborers here, which is why I've put them all in red boxes. But we begin really thinking about this type of work by always asking, if we have an object, who made the object? It's the perfect starting point, right? But then we continue with a series of questions to flesh out the craftsperson's life. And like I mentioned earlier, when we examine these objects, we step away from traditional art history, the traditional art history way of examining objects, and we think beyond connoisseurship. And one of my favorite questions that we have on screen here is, how is craft knowledge produced by Black life? And what I mean when I ask that question, I'm thinking specifically about those bits of craft knowledge that were learned on the job and passed down from craftsperson to craftsperson. And some of the other questions that I have here on screen was, how did this object impact the craftsperson's reality? Who was their family? What skill or knowledge did the creation of this object require? What relationship did the craftsperson have with other craftspeople? And I'm also thinking about who cleaned and cared for the object. I'm thinking about that specifically because in some instances, you often find that in the instances of enslaved cabinet makers, that they, of course, produced furniture, but that they often lived on site near that furniture. And if it ever broke, they were then called back in to repair it. So these are the things that we're thinking about as we think about ways to center Black craftspeople in this work. And so one of the questions we are often asked is, will we go beyond South Carolina? And of course, the answer to that is yes. I previously mentioned work in Tennessee and Jamaica, but we also have research ongoing in the following areas of Maryland, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. And so in doing this work, we also want to encourage archives, museums, and historic sites to ask new questions. And again, I'm using that example of the Pinckney Mansion, of using that example to show what a little extra research could uncover. And it uncovered the names of all of these other enslaved craftsmen in the red boxes that helped to construct that home. And we are looking to increase our contributions and collaborations. We love to hear from anybody who's interested in this type of work, from people who have also done this type of research, from people who have Black craftspeople in their families. You can contribute and, of course, share your stories and findings, and all of that goes into the archive attributed to you. And when it's allowed, we'd love to participate in more community engagement. This is an image from a sunny day last November. And my colleague and me, Victoria, visited the William Edmondson studio and home site because the state of Tennessee was unveiling their new historic marker. And while being at that site for that visit, we also got to hear from Edmondson's grandniece, and you can see her in the picture on the far right at the microphone. But we want to continue to do that type of work and to engage with historical groups and others who are highlighting craftspeople. And if you look in the middle there, you can see a picture of Edmondson sitting on the ground. He was a stonemason, and he was the very first African-American to have a show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And of course, I want to take a moment here to just highlight the people who helped me in this work, my team. I am so very grateful for them, and even more grateful for them now as we work very hard to complete this push into Tennessee in the next 2 weeks. All right, thank you. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. So I think I will turn it back over to Kristen.
Hi. Thank you so much, Tiffany. That was incredible.
Thank you.
I'd seen the presentation before, but I mean, it's just incredible. And lots of questions. I have a few myself, but I'm going to hear from some of our guests. I'll just jump right in. Did you track down some artifacts whose makers you were able to trace, such as ceramics, small pieces of furniture, etc.?
Sure. So in terms of ceramics, everybody or most people tend to know the story of David Drake, the enslaved potter down in Edgefield, South Carolina, because he left verses behind on the pots that he was throwing and making, and he often signed his name to them. But one thing I think people don't realize is that Dave wasn't alone in that work. That particular, one of the kilns that he worked at was owned by a gentleman named B.F. Landrum, and that was a massive site. And there were other men, other women, and other children there also throwing those types of pots. And what makes them very unique is that they have a very distinct glaze on the outside of them, an alkaline glaze. And yes, certainly, what you see happening in that particular story is that with emancipation, a lot of those freedmen and women continue working at the potteries, and they have left behind work contracts that you can find in Freedmen's Bureau records.
Are you something you just touched on the question of learned skills? If are some of the skills we use today learned and passed on from these enslaved carpenters, for instance? And so a question presented is, have you been able to trace generations of Black craftspeople from not necessarily family generations, but from craftsperson to apprentice?
I think some of the best examples of that involves a family, but there's a second part to it. So Henry Taylor was a free carpenter who lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and he helped to build the Bellamy Mansion there, which is a museum. You can Google them and see how grand that home is. But Henry Taylor had a son named Robert Taylor, who Henry taught the house carpentry trade to. Robert Taylor then goes to MIT. He's the first Black person there to get a degree. And then Robert Taylor goes down to Tuskegee, Alabama, where he becomes a professor at what's now known as Tuskegee University. And so in that particular example, Robert took the trade that he learned from his father to MIT. Then he took it down to Tuskegee. And then Tuskegee at the time was a historically Black college. And so he began to teach the students at Tuskegee, essentially his father's trade. And then those students go out and they become industrial teachers at the country's Black schools. And then they in turn are teaching other students. And so you can sort of see how it goes and it sort of keeps going and traveling.
Absolutely. Can you say more about going beyond connoisseurship? You spoke about not following conventional art history research methods. Are you critical of connoisseurship?
I think it has its place, but I think one thing that connoisseurship misses is a specific focus onto the crafts person. So often with connoisseurship, you are very much so looking at the materials that the object was made of. You're looking at the way that the object was put together. You're looking into the woods, the primary woods and the secondary woods if you're talking about furniture. And you're looking into the carvings and the moldings and all of these other things that you sometimes place the beauty of the object before the person who actually made it. And so I think that it has its place, but for us, since we're more interested in who actually made the object, it doesn't quite work for us. So that's why I put up the slide with all of those questions that we ask. And so we just sort of run through those questions and see how many we can answer about a specific object, and just an exercise to, again, center the crafts person.
Thank you. The piece by William Howard, I think it drew so many wows because it's so unique and in one sense, and it's a perfect time capsule. The objects that he carved and placed on the piece are of that time and of that moment and that person's life. And this is just a comment how amazing it would be to see a timeline of pieces that built up to that and pieces that have been inspired by that subconsciously stemming around his work right there. That would be amazing.
Definitely. I think like you mentioned, I think William Howard is just carving what he's seeing. Mm-hmm. And then he's adding it to the front of those desks.
It's just stunning. A personal question for you: of all the areas of material culture that you could have focused on in your work, why were you drawn to craft?
I think it may go back to my grandfather, who was a brick mason, and two of my uncles built furniture. So I think it may subconsciously sort of tie back to them, while I was always interested in the things that people were making. But yeah, I'm glad I found it because I fell in love with it and I like being here.
We're so happy you're here as well. What was the most interesting craftsperson and or object to research for you?
I think it would definitely, oh boy, there are so many. I think it would really have, oh, maybe it is the Pinckney Mansion. And I say that because there was so much documentation about that mansion just buried in the archives in South Carolina. There are 65 pages of worth of construction documents for that mansion. But whenever people had written about the house, they had just sort of casually mentioned John Williams as the carpenter. But then when I sort of pull the lid back and look very closely within those papers, you can see these what's essentially a building network, right? So you can see that Charles Pinckney was getting bricks from Parnassus Plantation, and that was a massive brick plantation in South Carolina, and all of those bricks were made by enslaved individuals. And then you can see that he is getting pine wood and cypress wood, again, coming from timber plantations. So then you really began to think about this is a story that goes beyond John Williams the carpenter. It goes beyond the other enslaved carpenters on that site. And now it's to brick makers and it's to wood sawyers. And one of the contractors on that house was a roof slater, and he had an enslaved work crew with him. And so it just began a story that started out as, John Williams, but there are actually hundreds and hundreds of more Black craftspeople involved in that story.
So that leads me, well, that was your origin story, really, wasn't it? That was sort of your tip-off point right there.
Mhm.
Do you, if you're moving on to Tennessee now, so this is kind of I don't know if you can answer this. How much information are you getting, or how many contributions are you getting? And is it overwhelming, or are you moving on to Tennessee because that's where the research is taking you, and maybe Charleston is slowed down?
Sure. So the way that it works is Charleston research is ongoing. So after Tennessee debuts at the end of this month, about a month from now, more Charleston research will debut. So we're running them sort of concurrently. But initially, when I thought about the project, I was thinking about John Williams, but I'm from Tennessee. And so initially I was like, let me start with Tennessee first. So it's always been there in the back of my mind, but I knew how easy it was to find this information for South Carolina. And I knew it was going to be a lot easier um, because the period of enslavement in South Carolina is so much longer than it is for Tennessee, just because Tennessee is a state that's formed much later. And so, yeah, that's how we ended up in South Carolina first. But yeah, all of the research sort of runs concurrently.
And are you getting, I mean, how much information are people feeding you? Are you getting information from outside sources?
Sure.
On your contribution page is kind of what I'm getting at.
Sure. So we'd like more, more contributions for sure. But some of that South Carolina research that you'll see here, and then in the next month comes from an independent researcher. And we've had invitations from others to include research in regions that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But they will, when those areas debut, will definitely include that research. And oftentimes we just get random emails that say things like, my grandfather was a crafts person and he lived here, or, things like that. And so we strike up conversations with those people to learn more.
Thank you. So that leads me to two other questions. One is, do you work with volunteers? There are some guests here that live in, South Carolina or Tennessee, and do you need volunteers for your research?
We'd love to. Please, please reach out to us. What we're doing right now is putting together sort of a framework for volunteers to be able to help us. We hadn't had one before. But yeah, we'd love to hear from them.
And the second question, something you just touched on, have you heard have you connected or been connected with any ancestors of any of these Black craftspeople that you have researched and given ownership to?
Not yet. And part of me thinks that's because we started it with 18th century South Carolina. But Tennessee, we're taking all the way from about 1810 until 1900. So I'm hopeful that somebody will reach out to us and say that one of their relatives are there.
Yes. A question, is there any history of the works of enslaved people in the North? And I think we've touched on this before.
Oh, absolutely. I went to a lecture last night given by a researcher at the University of Delaware named Jennifer Van Horn. And she'd actually found an amazing runaway slave advertisement for an enslaved painter. And it was out of Massachusetts. And the advertisement never calls him a painter, but it mentions that when he ran away, um, he was in his work apron that was splattered with dyes. And so you begin to immediately think maybe he's mixing paints or something to have an apron splattered with dye. So, oh, yes. And there's another story that I found out of um, the North. I can't quite remember the state, but it's definitely New England, of an enslaved craftsperson who ran away with a notebook. And the advertisement mentioned this enslaved person was literate. And the advertisement mentioned that he had been spotted sort of hanging around the city taking notes in his notebook. So there are just, there are thousands of these stories. And one of the easiest ways to find them is, of course, through newspaper advertisements. You can get like a subscription to newspapers.com, or you can look at some of these for free through the Library of Congress, chronicling America. And one of the sort of search terms that we always use it's sort of area specific, but we'll use search terms like Negro carpenter, Negro blacksmith, runaway, things like that to pull those advertisements.
This is a really great question. Have you found records of first-person accounts by enslaved and/or self-emancipated people that touched on their personal relationship to their own craft?
I think one of the best examples of this is probably a memoir written by an enslaved and later self-emancipated craftsperson named Boston King. And he's in South Carolina. And he's written a memoir that you can find out on the web for free. But his name's Boston King. And he recalls in that memoir his work in a cabinet shop in Charleston. And he talks about things like how he was in charge of caring for the tools and making sure that the tools got put up at the end of the day. He also mentions how terrible the shop owner was to him, how terrible the treatment was. And then he also, because Boston King was in a situation where he was owned by someone else but hired out to work in a cabinet making shop. And so he talks about the relationship between the owner of the cabinet making shop as well as the relationship between the man who enslaved him, all the while sort of talking about his work. And he talks about how he ends up self-emancipating and he actually ends up in Canada. So yeah, I would Google Boston King memoir, South Carolina.
Can we contribute research for states other than South Carolina at this time?
Yes, and what we do is that we'll hold it. And when that state debuts, we'll get back in touch with you and make sure that you still will allow us to publish that work.
Mm-hmm. Real quick for Anne McLean, can you repeat the name of the pottery that you referenced earlier in the very first question?
Sure. So it was B.F. Landrum, and it stands for Benjamin Franklin Landrum, Landrum. And that was one of the potteries where David Drake worked.
Great. I have more questions. I think if we didn't get to your question, I'm going to email these to Tiffany afterwards, and maybe we can get her to answer them directly to you. I want to just comment personally, you must go to the website and just scroll through the advertisements. It is phenomenal. Not only the images, but how everything's broken down. The dates, the years, the language. I mean, I was looking at 1737, 1743, just really phenomenal. So if you haven't been to blackcraftspeople.org yet, you must do it. It's phenomenal.
And if you want an easy way to contact me, I just put my email address in the chat box. So please feel free to send me an email.
Thank you. And I will get all of these questions to you as well so that nobody will go unanswered. And that's our event for you. And Tiffany, I can't thank you enough. What an amazing project you have going on. And I hope that our guests here are on your website, and I hope that it just, brings attention to it.
Great, great. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and please visit Tiffany at blackcraftspeople.org.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.